Thank you very much. That's a little loud, isn't it? How's the volume? Is it good at the back there? All right. Well, thank you, Joachim. Joachim gave you an excellent global perspective of what we can expect and what's going on in the various parts of the world. I have to say, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be primarily from a North American and mostly US perspective. So most of the numbers you see, whether it be secondary research or whether it be actual measurement data that we've collected from organizers as well as exhibitors, is primarily around and US centric. However, there are a lot of applications, and as the title suggests, exhibitions must deliver, and to Joachim's point earlier, the even more was put there intentionally because value is ongoing. And the reason I said in the post-recession world, you have to deliver even more value. So it's not that we are making a shift at all. We hopefully should have been delivering value all through. And this past recession has been deep and wide across all industries, and certainly exhibitions have been no exception. However, it does provide for new opportunities as well as challenges. And I think one of the key things is it gives us the ability to prove to exhibitors the value proposition to this constituency. And furthermore, as organizers, maybe we can take the lead in actually directing them to help them understand the value, prove their own participation at exhibitions, and then ultimately communicate this value to their management, who are our ultimate customers, which are the CMOs. They are the ones who are making the marketing budgets, which represent our revenue streams. So hopefully, if we can talk their language, you know, in our trade show and exhibition world, we typically tend to talk about leads, we talk about booth traffic, terms like that. However, we have to start to relate now to that higher level management. And a lot of these same terms can be converted. So hopefully I'm going to share with you some of the initiatives of the CMOs, how we can provide value to both our exhibitors. There's certainly a whole other area, which is the buyers. But for purposes of this presentation, we're going to stick to the exhibitors. Now, I know we have a Q&A at the end of the talk. However, please feel free, if as I go along, if you have questions, raise your hand and I'd be happy to answer it. And, this is a fairly large group, but if we get a short discussion going, that wouldn't be a bad thing. So let's start. I guess this is not working. Oh, there we go. So this is really the only slide I have which is global in nature. And primarily, most of you might have seen this already. This is an UFI study that was done for the various regions amongst organizers. And I think the key thing that I would like to point out here is that when you look at 2010 and also going into 2011, you see a lot more green, which is now the increases, except for perhaps, which it's really not that weak, but even in Europe, when you compare it to the rest of the regions, perhaps this was some of the dark clouds that Joachim was referring to, not as strong as what you're seeing in Asia, certainly, and then also in the US and the Middle East. Now let's bring it back to the US here. The CEIR, which is the Center of Exhibition Industry Research, here are some of the 4 metrics that they monitor. They create the SEER index. So you have floor space, you have exhibiting companies, delegates, and revenue. Now, the top line there is the projection for 2010. And quite frankly, it's a moving target. And by that I mean, depending upon who you talk to, those numbers are going to change. Now, the current news coming out of the index was that the third quarter was very positive. I believe that if the fourth quarter continues in the same vein, then the results you're going to see there in total is probably not going to be a minus 2.5. We're probably going to end up on the positive side. But again, we don't know that at this point in time. This is the best projection, and there may be others out there. So it's really just for illustration at this point to see what's going on. Now, another study by B2B magazine about the 2010 outlook. What's I think really key here is when you look at overall marketing budgets, and then you look at event budgets, there's some nice increases, but events are not keeping pace with overall marketing. That's because of the influences of other channels. So you have social media. You have certainly a lot of the digital influences and virtual shows, et cetera, that are competing for the budget. So when you look at the increase and the decrease for events, it's like a plus 10 in increase, whereas it's a lot more of plus 26 overall marketing. So while budgets are improving for events, the pace is not keeping up. So the only way to counteract that is we must continue to prove that the value proposition at our events is strong. And I have to say, in the past, the focus has primarily been on the delegates or attendees or buyers, depending upon which part of the world you are and which terms you use. And certainly, they are a key constituent to shows. However, we do have to make sure that our exhibitors, particularly in this day and age, where they're becoming a lot more savvy, they're becoming a lot more sophisticated, they are evaluating their performance, they're making very strategic decisions of being in your event. We have to make sure that we cater to their needs. And more importantly, we have to make sure that we understand their objectives for going into shows and for, more specifically, for going into your event. So that becomes really critical. So what are the primary goals of some of the CEOs for 2010? Number one, customer acquisition. Well, our events, face-to-face events, have a strong value proposition as it relates to customer acquisition. And if this is their number one initiative, and it says here for 2010, but I can certainly see it for the next several years, this is where we already have an inherent advantage in our face-to-face medium. So let's make sure that we capitalize on this advantage of ours. Customer retention and brand awareness. Now notice that these are the terms we want to be able to talk to. So customer acquisition, what is it? I mean, nothing more than your delegates at the event, okay? So, but when you talk to the CMO and you talk to them in terms of customer acquisition, suddenly it rings a bell and it resonates with them. So all I'm saying is, even though for the majority of us, our communication is with that exhibit manager, a level above, and perhaps not with the CMO level, we have to make sure we educate the level, the exhibit manager level, to ultimately take the conversation to a notch higher. All right, so we saw the ups and downs, but here's the bright side, and it says the exhibition's down but not out. So you look at the 4 years here, and 2010 is really a half year. This is data based on research at exhibitions that we have done over the years. So when you look at some key metrics, total buying plans, the percentage of the audience that are planning to buy one or more of the types of products that are exhibited by exhibitors. When you see that number, understandably, you see in 2008 and 2009, you would expect a dip because of the recession. People are not making purchases. Well, now you're starting to see that it's going up. And my guess is that when the year is out, we'll probably be at a level that's probably close to 50, 51% and more the norm. So we are heading in the right direction. Net buying influences. What is the quality of our audience? All of you have this data based on the attendees that come to your shows. But my experience is, and I don't want to generalize, of course, but for many events, this data does not get out past, past the organizers who have it. So it must be shared with those that actually can do something with it. The value of attending, this is the conference is all about value. So this is a question based upon the amount of time that you invested at the event, whether you're an exhibitor or whether you're an attendee or a delegate or a buyer, how much value do you place on the event? And the scores that you see there, or the percentages, are the people who said excellent or very good value. Now, when you look at those numbers and you look at 2010, might seem a little contradictory, and you may say, okay, buying plans is going up, the quality of the audience is fairly strong. However, the value for attending is around 65%. But I wouldn't be too concerned about this because this is really just half a year's data. And I expect that to normalize by the time we get to the end of the year because we are seeing that value at most of the events actually going up. So this is a good sign. Now, let's keep in mind, although much of what I'm going to be talking about this morning is going to be focused on the relationship between the organizers and exhibitors, it's important to understand the ecosystem, as I call it, the exhibition value ecosystem. So you have the organizers, you have the exhibitors, and then you have the delegates. And let's not forget the suppliers who are right in the middle there. They are the ones who make sure that everything works together and in harmony. And quite frankly, a lot of the low value that exhibitors report sometimes will point to suppliers. So we have to make sure that that relationship is monitored between the three key constituents here. Now, each one of us, whether we are an organizer or we are an exhibitor or we are a delegate, we have different needs, we have different objectives when we go to a show. On the exhibitors, certainly we are looking for ROI, trying to prove our return on investment, return on objectives, that's the ROO. If we are delegates or attendees, we are looking for information, good content. We are looking for that interaction between ourselves and exhibitors because ultimately that is the one key advantage that we have in this entire face-to-face medium. So we have to keep in mind the reasons why each one is coming to a particular show. And how can you do that? You can do that by making sure there is a dialogue between yourself and the exhibitors as well as the attendees. Now, I'm going to get into a little more detail about how we can establish certain relationships and what we must be looking at, but I thought the broad perspective of understanding the whole value system was important because it just doesn't rely on only attendees or only exhibitors or only suppliers. It's everyone working together. Now, let's look at the top issues facing organizers and exhibitors. Now, many of these issues are not new. However, their intensity and their importance today is a lot more significant. So, for instance, when you look at the exhibitor issues, competition for marketing budget, that is becoming a reality today because of the various other options that exhibitors have. So we have to look at what's happening there in terms of competition, what's happening to the budget. Less emphasis on the show floor. Now, don't let this alarm you. Yes, they are certainly looking at, does it make sense for me to be in a particular show or not? However, the key here is, what are some other options that are available to me? And recently had a conversation with a very large exhibitor of a major corporation in the US. And he told me, he says, when I engage with an organizer, I would much rather have a conversation of, what are your objectives? What are you trying to accomplish at this show? Rather than, how much booth space do you want at this event? Because I may actually end up spending twice as more or 3 times as more at your event. It may not be in booth space. It may be in other off-floor activities. It may be in sponsorships. It may be in various other categories. But the total package may end up being a lot more revenue for you than a trade show for demand generation. You know, we've talked about, and it's ongoing, we've talked about corporations and exhibitors having their own private events, and yes, there are certain advantages, and some of you may be competing against some of those primary events. But if the number one objectives for most CEOs is customer acquisition, guess what? That's not the area where that's going to happen. You know, 77% of attendees or buyers to a private event are customers. So to use, I would imagine, a very American term, it's like preaching to the choir. Okay? So you're really talking to your own customers. They're already invested in you. They already know about you. So at those private events, that's what you're getting. Whereas at the trade show, you have, and I've got some data later to show the importance of the reach you get at a trade show. When you look at the exhibition organizers, on the other hand, clearly you see the challenges. Increasing value is one of them to attendees and organizers. High attrition rates of exhibitors, your exhibitors dropping out of shows, some of them out of your own shows. And why is that? It's because they are becoming a lot more sophisticated, they're becoming a lot more strategic in the decisions that they make to participate at an event. And you can actually help that process and may actually help keep a number of exhibitors at your event because perhaps they are making uninformed decisions. So you get the typical situation, and this is where a lack of data comes into play. You get the typical situation when you go to an organizer and you say, well, you know, your exhibitors are asking for information. They're asking for data on your audience. And the response you get from the organizer, well, no one has approached me. And it's sort of this catch-22. The organizers are saying the exhibitors are not asking for data, and the exhibitors are saying the organizers are not giving us information. So you have this void. So there has to be better communication. And that will happen once there is a stronger relationship between both you as well as and your customers. Attracting the millennials. So this is the whole next generation of those who are coming to our shows. You know, right now, from all research that we've done, the average age at shows, at least in the US, is 42 years old. Now, I would imagine in Asia, it could be a lot lower. I don't know what that stat is. But the next generation, they have different needs, different wants. Their learning styles are different. So what do we have to do to keep up with attracting them and meeting their needs? And then we talked about the competition from private events. We certainly have to keep that on our radar. What happens there, virtual events as well. We've got to embrace them. They're not the answer, as many exhibitors are finding out. Certainly, the barrier to entry and the cost to entry is a lot lower than a face-to-face event. But the advantages of the face-to-face medium are very clear. So again, when you actually measure the two, the results can be very startling. All right, this one here, the title is rather provocative. It says, "Are you ready for change?" Because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to require you to think a little differently. So what you have here was a study done amongst organizers, and we asked them about their attitudes towards adoption of new attendee marketing solutions. And various other things were included in the study. But the key here is, where do you see yourselves, either individually, as an organization, when you look at this adoption life cycle? The bottom line here is the average adoption life cycle. And then on the top there, the percentages where you see innovators, 25%, early adopters, 39%. Those were the percentages of organizers who placed themselves in those categories. So clearly, they're in the front of the curve, which means they are innovators, and the independents more so than the associations. The associations tend to be a little further down in that curve, perhaps early and late majority. So you have to see, as an organization, where are you in here? Are you going to wait for everyone else to jump on board before you actually do something? Or are you going to be one, if not the first one of the first few to adopt new solutions and to take advantages of opportunities that might present themselves? Now, part of the same study had a number of agreement and disagreement statements. And if you look at the top one, those organizers who strongly agreed, what do you think was the top one? Exhibitor partnerships are critical. But again, to use a saying, this is more like, do as I say, but not as I do. Because quite frankly here, they may be thinking this and believing this and knowing that this is important. However, my experience is that not enough of this is happening. Not enough of this partnership is taking place. And so that's where we have to change the way we think. Online is more cost-effective than traditional marketing tools. That's certainly true. I'm not so sure about this one. Marketing 3 years will be almost entirely online. More than half of them said that. Whether that will actually happen, I don't know. Certainly there are cost advantages of that. But again, the important thing is, and the reason I have this in here, is again for you to focus your minds on the whole exhibitor partnership aspect of what we're going to be talking about. So here is, to use Joachim's term, here's the whole antisocial element here with the use of digital tools. And really at this point in time, it's to recognize these percentages you see here are organizers who are using these tools. Now, keep in mind, you may look at some of these numbers and say, wow, those are extremely high. You know, Facebook, 77%, Twitter, 62%. The reality of it is, and my suspicion is, that in most of these cases, it's just someone who has a Facebook page. And so they can say that they are part of this whole social media revolution. Now, we do have to embrace it, because exhibitors clearly are using social media in their promotion. But I think where we have to get smart about it is what's effective and how best can we use social media? And then more importantly, how do we monitor the discussions that are taking place on blogs and Twitter? Can we be part of it? You know, there's no point saying we have a page out there and then not doing anything about it. So if you want to get into the game, like they say you have to play to win, if you want to get into the game, you have to make sure there is that commitment level. And again, it goes side by side with whatever you are currently doing. So here's another study that was done by Champion earlier this year. And all it's doing is giving you a guideline as to how organizers are using these various tools in the event cycle. So if you look at Facebook, you look at LinkedIn, et cetera, see how they're using it. Now, for instance, streaming video of keynotes, obviously on-site and after the fact would be higher percentages. Now, I personally feel and work with a number of shows that are actually using Facebook for pre-show speaker recruitment and content. Great way to actually get ideas on content because, as they say, and you know, it's not new, but content is king. That's going to drive the success of events, because in today's world, for someone to justify attending an event, spending that time, spending that money, they have to be able to come to your event, learn, and go back to their respective organizations and apply what they have learned. In the old days, it was fine to come to class, much like this, and listen to a lecture or listen to a speaker and then be done and go home. Today, you actually have to be able to take the information and use it. That's what's going to be important. So think about it at your shows when you're developing the education program. It's all about creating the content and how strong and how relevant that content is. So there's the show floor certainly, but the education is just as important because in most events, it represents a significant revenue stream. All right, so let me pose some questions to you and we'll attempt to answer them. And so here are some 4 questions. What type of information are we currently providing our exhibitors? And do they trust our information? The next one is, how can we substantiate to exhibitors that our event accelerates the sales process? Critical. Our event is a driving force in overall sales that take place. How do we establish strategic relationships with exhibitors? What are the requirements? What are the prerequisites? And then should our revenue model be based on value and quality of an audience rather than space? Do we want it to be based on the value of the audience that we are delivering, or do we want it to be transactional in nature? We're selling booth space. Because today, exhibitors are taking a more holistic approach to their participation at shows. So again, we're going to go through each one of these and we'll help you understand how we can answer some of these questions. And some of them truly will pose some challenges to us. So let's look at the first one. What type of information are we providing? And do they trust the information that we do provide? Well, I have to say that even today, trust is a big factor. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm specifically talking about the US, that you could be experiencing a different situation here. But there are many events where the exhibitors just do not believe the attendee numbers they get from the organizers. There was a movement a few years ago for exhibition audits, which had some momentum, but today, less than 100 shows of the total universe of roughly 13,000 in North America are audited. So what does that say to you? And yes, there's some of the larger ones, but essentially, we're not getting a lot of validation in numbers. Now, there are some exceptions, like for instance, the healthcare industry specifically. Those numbers, at least in the US, are very reliable. So again, they may not be a consistent standard from one show to the next, but at least the exhibitor knows that the number is accurate or fairly close to accurate. So the trust factor is right now, if you don't have the trust, then you got to work very hard at actually building that trust. And that's going to come from opening up your attendee database, sharing information, giving them the true counts of your buyers, segmenting your data, giving them a profile of who's coming relevant to what they are looking for. We are finding today that attendees are becoming a lot more data-driven in making their decisions. You know, yes, there are a few that are still going to go back to the same shows year after year after year because that's what they've always done. However, the smarter ones, the ones who are a lot more strategic in nature, are actually evaluating whether the shows fit with their strategic initiatives. Are these in line with our business objectives? Now, not a factor for the large shows or the key shows or the lead shows, but when you get down to the verticals, which a lot of you produce, that becomes a factor because for many companies, their initiatives change from one year to the next. So they could be pulling out of the event. So unless you're providing information that will help them actually make informed decisions, you could end up with them actually pulling out of your show just because of lack of data and lack of information. So let's start here with an understanding of how exhibitors optimize their performance at shows. So think of this as a wheel, if you will, in the overall exhibitor optimization of ROI and ROO, which is return on investment and return on objectives. So it all starts at the very top there. The show strategy, alignment with business objectives, understanding what the show strategy is, and taking it to various levels in terms of understanding what the exhibitor is looking to do. You have show selection and investment for exhibitors who are planning to select certain shows, the level of investment they are planning to make. They need information to make those decisions about your event. The key tactical drivers, what are those drivers that you can impact to maximize an exhibitor's return on investment? We're going to look at an actual exhibit performance model, and you'll see the areas that you can actually impact. Then you go to lead generation and follow-up. Here, perhaps your influence is going to be a lot less than you could have in the other areas, but I think it's important from an overall perspective to understand, at least have a knowledge, so you can have that conversation with some of your key exhibitors. And Joachim mentioned a statistic earlier about the 70% of exhibitors who do not follow up on their leads. And sadly, even today, that's true. You would think that that would be a much smaller number today, where people are going after that every last lead. But yes, there are still corporations, there are still companies where it is not happening. So we're going to look at a suggested way to follow up. And I think the key thing here is you have to understand that it's a conversation that's going to revolve around not just with sales, but with marketing as well. Because marketing is are the people that actually will prep you up, and then the follow-up comes from sales. And then lastly, measurement. You know, measuring your performance or helping exhibitors measure their performance. Now, certainly you can't do that with everyone, but perhaps some of your anchor exhibitors, helping them prove the value they get out of your specific exhibition is important. And there are various levels of measurement. You don't have to do something very sophisticated, but you can certainly guide them in particular areas. So now let's look at this customer continuum. Along the bottom here, you have the typical customer continuum from awareness to advocacy. So this is awareness for your company, awareness for your products, et cetera, consideration, purchase, et cetera. When you look at these four things that are shaded here, I don't know if you can see the shading well enough, but these are all face-to-face activities. Exhibits, attending the event, speakerships, off-floor activities. So why this comes under the strategic, understanding the strategic initiatives is you have to realize with each of your customers, where are they, what are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to achieve awareness for their company, consideration for their products? Or are they at the very end towards advocacy? Because when you're having the conversation, as I mentioned earlier, it should not just be all about booth space. Certainly that's a key factor, and that is why exhibits span a lot of that continuum. But if you understand their reasons and their marketing initiatives, their business objectives, it's going to give you a much easier feel and understanding for the direction your conversation needs to go in. Now, take it to another level, and that is understanding whether a specific exhibitor is operating in an emerging market or a mature market, because the implications are different in terms of their business drivers as well as in terms of the event activities. What is it that you can propose to them? So as you get closer towards mature markets, then yes, their customer events become more important, speakerships become more important, virtual events become more important. Have those conversations. It's going to pay tenfold, because if nothing else, it will give your customer the feeling that you truly do understand their business and you are willing to invest and make sure that they get the maximum return out of their investment at your show. Now, when we come down to show selection and investment, show selection is probably the single most important decision that exhibitor has to make. If they are faced with budget cuts, they have, resources are limited. So if they are told by their management or their CMO, you have to cut X number of shows next year, or you have to cut X number of dollars next year, well, they need some information to make those decisions. So here is where it becomes important to provide at least certain basic levels of information to your exhibitors. Now, I've given you a sense of some key things here. This is by no means a complete list or an exhaustive list. I would encourage you to give them as much information as possible, but at least let's start here. Provide them with attendance numbers. And when I say attendance numbers, valid numbers in terms of the total, how many are exhibitors, how many are buyers, etc., so that it'll help them define their target audience. Because here's what happens, and this is important to understand. If you inflate your attendance numbers or your buyer numbers, an exhibitor will inflate their potential audience at an event. And what that's going to lead to is expectations that are much higher than they should be. And ultimately what's going to happen is they're going to fall short. And they're going to say, well, the show wasn't very good for us. So let's start off by defining for them, giving them a realistic expectation of what to expect. It's only 10% or it's only 20%.